It's been a shameful week in many ways. Monday saw a huge debate on free speech in India following the decision of a big publishing house to withdraw a leading academic's book on an alternative take on Hinduism. On Tuesday, India was given a shameful rank of 140 on the map of press freedom. And today, in many ways, is the worst of all. Democracy reduced to a new low with scenes of scuffles, pepper sprays and downright hooliganism over the issue of Telangana playing out live in our parliament. All that and lots more on the social network today. But first, barely 48 hours ago, Indians on social media outraged on an increasingly dangerous trend of a clampdown on our right to free speech. This time by a big publishing house which refused to fight for a leading academic's right to interpret Hinduism in an alternative way. They decided to withdraw all her books and pulp them. 2 days later, not a word from them yet on why they did this. Their silence a clear indication they gave in to pressure from a right-wing fringe group, which is preparing to drag Wendy's next book also to court. But the narrative of silence doesn't end with Penguin. What about our leaders, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, Arvind Kejriwal and BJP's Narendra Modi? Not a word from any of them about this growing atmosphere of censorship. Add to that the law that Wendy mentions in her statement as the real villain in the piece, which makes it a criminal rather than a civil offense to publish a book. That offense. In that circle, individual writers, artists and readers are left to fend for themselves. And that's what we discuss on the social network today. Why no Wendy over tea? Before we introduce our guests on the show today, let's quickly listen into some of the writers and some of you who have come together to express your support for Wendy Doniger, but by reading out many pieces from various books. Let's listen into a couple of them.
Where was water to be found in the camp? The Brahmaputra was brimming with water, but all the pots in the camp were empty. When he begged for water, the sadistic guard would laugh at him. One day, however, they did give him water. They took off his blindfold and forced him to watch them urinate into a jug. When the jug was put to Saddam's lips, he had turned his head away in disgust. But one of them had forced his mouth open while the other poured the contents of the jug in. Those who were watching this spectacle had broken into harsh laughter as the warm, salty liquid had trickled down his throat. Saddam had felt at the time that he would rather have drunk poison.
I have here 300 Ramayans and 5 examples and 3 thoughts on translation by A.K. Ramanujan. How many Ramayans? 300? 3000? At the end of some Ramayans, a question is sometimes asked. How many Ramayans have there been? And there are stories that answer the question. And Ramanujan tells us there are over 300 tellings and there is no one Ramayana. And I like this reading because after DU banned it from the English literature syllabus, we decided to take it on. And we teach it as part of a literary translation course. And to my mind, readings like these, which are taken off syllabi, and readings from books that can be pulped, really classify as ideas that will live, whether you pulp books and ban them.
All right, we're joined in the studio by Advaita Kala, who is the writer of the movie Kahani, screenwriter of the movie Kahani. We're also joined by Rahul Bose, who joins us from Mumbai. He's an actor. And we're also joined by Akhila Ramalingam, who is a lawyer who fights and advocates for free speech. Advaita, I want to start with you first because you're, of course, part of that community of writers and people who are increasingly finding themselves left to fend themselves when it comes to being able to express themselves exactly how they want. How do you feel about this today?
In a couple of ways. One of the reasons why I wanted to come onto the show was because of the reading, and I feel so strongly about the right of the reader. I mean, it's self-evident that as an author, I do feel very strongly about the freedom of expression, but I also feel for the reader and the fact that they don't have the option to make that choice, because the purveyors of culture, of faith, of what is palatable, what is not palatable, is in somebody else's hands. And to answer your question about politics, the reading that I wanted to do today was from the Red Saree, which is by Javier Moreau, and is a fictionalized biography of Sonia Gandhi, and it never came to be published. And the author went so far as to say in 2010 that publishing firms were being terrorized by politicians. So you have a space here that we operate in as creative people, wherein at least I applaud their lack of hypocrisy. where they haven't come out and made a statement about this book being withdrawn, because they really are in no place to make a statement when they've been perpetrators of the same kind of silencing of a literary voice.
But Adwaita, you know, one of the things that Wendy has talked about in her statement, I want to cut across to Akhila for that. Akhila, you know, one of the things that Wendy has talked about, the real villain in the piece she talks about is that section 295A, which she says is the law that is often used by people to, in that we end up landing up in these situations where we find ourselves censoring so much of what we really want to say.
Absolutely. India, on the one hand, guarantees the freedom of speech in the Constitution. On the other hand, does seem to take it away with several restrictive crimes against hate speech and many offensive speech. So what it boils down to is that you do have a right to free speech, but just, acceptable and inoffensive speech. This is quite an illiberal and sort of intolerant view. Something that is not shared by several free countries, and I don't think is conducive to democracy at all. So what happens here is that a lot of people, and I think Ramachandra Guha calls them professional offense takers, initiate litigation against any material, several authors and bona fide artists, and therefore stifle opposition and any kind of dissenting speech.
You know, Rahul, if I could just bring you in at this stage, are you, I just want to ask you, are you surprised that we've heard no word from our politicians? I mean, today, for example, Nancy Powell met BJP's prime ministerial candidate Narendra Modi. There was a really good chance for either of those statesmen to actually pick up this worrying trend of the muzzlement of free speech in this country. But nobody did it. We haven't heard a word from any politicians. It's not important. It's simply not on their agenda. Are you surprised by that?
Actually, I'm not interested in that angle at all. I think what's really interesting, and I said this when Salman was prevented from coming to Jaipur, Salman Rushdie, and I spoke in Jaipur at the time. I said, and I just, one of your other panelists, the grey areas in the Constitution. I think politicians outside and publishers outside of it, if we don't fight in the grey areas to either get them amended or to keep fighting in those grey areas to make sure that the verdicts come the way of the people, it's not going to happen. Publishers are always going to look at, they're going to say that they like to encourage literary excellence, but at the end of the day, they run businesses. And politicians are interested in other things like vote gathering and electability. So the responsibility at moments like this boils down to us. We have to fight tooth and nail for this. And you're absolutely right. It does boil down to the writer or the actor or the performer. Let me give you a small little example without taking too much of your time. In the acting and the direction and the film world, your film is made, it passes the censors, you think it's going to get screening, but let's say that the state government in a particular state bans it. You go to the High Court passes it, you go into the cinema halls, but the state government pleads that they cannot spare any police persons to protect in case there are some lumpen elements standing outside the cinema hall. So the film releases, one stone is thrown, the exhibitor says, please take your film away from here because I'm suffering. And the filmmaker understands and does. Through this entire chain, he or she is totally vulnerable. The fight is there. The fight has to be that once the CBFC rating is given, state governments will be beholden to screening the film and giving security. My point is this. It's not going to happen unless you get out there and fight. And I say you fight against corruption. Well, this is moral corruption. I say you fight against atrocities against people in this country. This is also an atrocity. So what needs to be done is to actually everyone understand the true import of what this is. What this is finally one day, you and me, Kashish, will be locked in a corner of our houses, fearing for anything that we can say, lest we be thrown behind bars.
You know, Adwaita, one of the things that people have talked about online a lot is, there's outrage. People are worried about the fact that today it's this, tomorrow it's going to be something else. But let's just look at this, and Rahul is talking about we have to keep fighting in the grey area. One of the things which many people are asking is that Section 2, why isn't there a growing demand to repeal that particular law?
I think, I'm a practitioner. as opposed to an expert in legalese. But what I do clearly feel, and comes from just pure experience, is that the ecosystem in which a writer operates in this country is very, very biased against the writer. Even if you look, and I'll go back to film because Rahul mentioned film, for example, I've signed a contract where I cannot make any political statements prior to the release of my film and a couple of weeks after it releases, because that may anger political parties and that would then reflect negatively on my film. So that's a gag order. So you speak of copyright laws. You speak of the entire ecosystem in which a writer works, and that is not conducive. So I think it's a very holistic change that needs to come into place. It isn't about the one book. I mean, this has been going on since 1925 when the first book was banned and the publisher was murdered after that. So this has been going on for a long, long time, and this is the environment in which we create, and that is problematic.
So, Rahul, I know you've talked a lot about fighting, and, Advaita agrees with you, and I would imagine so would be so many artists who are constantly trying to push the envelope in creativity in this country and engage in dialogue, even if that means, even if that means going against the mainstream. Can you suggest a way in which how you can continue this fight, given that the community seems to be obviously very small?
Well, clearly you have to mobilize opinion. If you have 10 million people on the streets, everyone's going to listen. So you had that, you've done it before, you can do it again. You have to pick and choose your battles, I agree. But this is a battle that, deceptively soft as it may seem, can become very, very, very hard for everyone, because it sets a precedent that there's no stopping the floodgates of intolerance after this. But we've opened those floodgates. Now what we're going to have to do is to try and strain to shut, or at least partially shut, those floodgates now, because those floodgates were opened years ago. So the straight answer is mobilize opinion, both virtually with the media and also physically. If you have people standing up and saying, we refuse to let this happen, governments will listen, because don't forget, it's about electability. It's about votes.
Yeah. Go ahead. And just to add to that, I also think that there needs to be a practical solution, because if you're ever in a situation as a writer in a legal battle, there comes a point where your publisher is with you, but to a point where his lawyers step in and they immediately start distancing themselves from the writer. So the writer is a very lonely figure in a fight like this.
In fact,
so
Advaita, was really interesting, and I mentioned that when I started the show as well, that, one of the very worrying things about what happened on Monday is the gentleman who actually petitioned and eventually got this book withdrawn in an out-of-court settlement is currently working and preparing a solid case to ensure that a second book is withdrawn as well. And, something like what happened on Monday sets a very, very dangerous precedent, doesn't it?
Absolutely, it does. And I think writers don't have, let's get really practical here, they don't have the bandwidth, the monetary, support to fight these cases. So I actually think on a very practical level there should be funds that pursue these cases of freedom of expression. And let's make no mistake here, bans have been brought on not only by religious fringe groups but also by politicians, by corporate houses who don't want to be projected in a certain way. So this is across the board, and it's not only about faith-based bans.